At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, the sky over Budapest was already at war. High above the city, at nearly 30,000 feet, a B-17G flying fortress moved steadily toward its target. The bomber's name was Mispa. Inside the cockpit sat First Lieutenant Evald Swanson, just 24 years old. This was his 17th combat mission. By now, he knew the numbers. He knew the odds. In the 15th Air Force, statistics were brutal. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a bomber, only 2 were likely to come home. The rest would die, disappear, or become prisoners. Swanson pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the sky ahead. Black clouds suddenly burst around the formation. Flak. Heavy anti-aircraft fire exploded in sharp, violent flashes. Each burst marked where a shell had detonated, sending razor-sharp metal in every direction. From this altitude, the bursts looked almost beautiful. Up close, they were deadly. Below them lay the railway yards and oil facilities of German-controlled Budapest. Around those targets, the Luftwaffe had built a wall of steel. More than 200 heavy flak guns, including powerful 88mm cannons, were firing non-stop. They were not aiming at one plane. They were filling the sky. Mispa was one of 60 bombers from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of southern Italy. The mission sounded simple when it was written on paper. Destroy the Shell oil refinery. Cripple the railway yards. Cut supply lines feeding the Eastern Front. Then turn south and go home. But war was never simple. The formation pressed forward, straight into the flak. The B-17 shuddered as explosions rocked the air around it. Aluminum skin rattled. The bomber was strong, but not invincible. Shrapnel tore through the tail section. Then the wings were hit. Warning lights flickered. But the aircraft stayed in formation. Behind Swanson, the crew remained at their stations. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, sat quietly beside him. In the nose of the aircraft, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley, the bombardier, lay flat behind the Norden bombsight. Next to him, Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson, the navigator, checked his charts one final time. 8 other men filled the bomber. Gunners. A radio operator. A flight engineer. Each man knew his role. Each man trusted the others with his life. The target was seconds away. Bombs away. Dudley released the payload. 2 tons of high explosive dropped from Mispa's bomb bay, falling toward the railway yards far below. The aircraft jumped upward as the weight suddenly vanished. For a split second, it felt like they might survive this run. Then it happened. An 88mm shell struck the very front of the aircraft. The explosion was instant. The nose of Mispa simply disappeared. There was no fireball, no slow destruction. One moment, the bomber had a nose. The next, it did not. Everything forward of the cockpit was gone. The bombardier station vanished. The navigator's compartment vanished. The Norden bombsight vanished. Plexiglass, metal, wiring, instruments, men. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died instantly. The blast wave tore through the aircraft like a giant hand. Blood and debris slammed into the cockpit. Freezing air rushed inside with a scream. At 30,000 feet, the temperature was more than 40 degrees below zero. Swanson stared forward in shock. Where the nose of the bomber had been, there was now open sky. The entire instrument panel was gone. The control yoke was gone. The floor ahead of him no longer existed. Wind tore at his flight suit, trying to pull him forward into the empty space. Blood coated the metal around his seat. The center of gravity shifted violently. With no weight in the nose, Mispa pitched upward, climbing almost straight into the sky. The bomber began to stall. Swanson had no airspeed indicator. No altimeter. No artificial horizon. He had no instruments at all. He could see blue sky where gauges used to be. Somehow, the aircraft was still together. And somehow, it was still flying. Swanson felt rather than saw what the bomber was doing. Years of training took over. He reacted by instinct, by pressure, by the horizon beyond the massive hole in front of him. The control cables were still attached. They were exposed now, whipping violently in the wind, but they had not snapped. Swanson forced the nose down. There was nothing solid to push or pull, but he made it work. The bomber leveled out, just barely, and rejoined the formation in a loose, uneven line. It should not have been possible. No flight manual covered this situation. No engineer had designed a bomber to fly without a nose, without instruments, without a cockpit. MISPA stayed airborne because physics allowed it to, and because the man in the pilot's seat refused to give up. Behind Swanson, the surviving crew began moving forward. They could see the damage. They could see the open cavity where the nose had been. They could see the steel control cables running through the fuselage, now fully exposed. They understood something was very wrong. The flak did not stop. At 9:44 a.m., another shell found its mark. This one hit engine number 2. The right inboard engine exploded in a spray of oil and metal. Flames streamed backward along the wing. The propeller spun wildly for a few seconds, then froze. Engine number 2 was dead. Now MISPA had 3 engines instead of 4. The bomber began to slow. The formation ahead kept moving. They could not wait. Every extra second over enemy territory meant death. MISPA started falling behind. Swanson had no way to measure speed or altitude. He could only feel the loss of power. He could only guess how fast they were losing ground. In the bomb bay, Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie, the flight engineer, saw the problem immediately. Without someone physically holding the control cables steady, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. There was no discussion. No hesitation. The men moved into position. They would use their own strength to fly the plane. The moment engine number 2 died, MISPA became a different aircraft. With one engine gone and the nose completely missing, drag increased sharply. The bomber no longer moved like the stable flying fortress it had been designed to be. It felt heavy. Sluggish. Unbalanced. The formation ahead kept moving forward. They had to. Bomber doctrine was clear. Any aircraft that could not maintain formation speed was left behind. Waiting meant more exposure to fighters and flak. Waiting meant death for everyone. MISPA began to drift backward. Inside the bomber, the surviving crew felt it immediately. The vibration changed. The sound of the engines was uneven now. The wind rushing through the open nose cavity screamed like a living thing. In the bomb bay, Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie stared at the exposed control cables. Normally, these steel cables ran through pulleys and guide channels, hidden behind metal panels. They connected the pilot's controls to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. Now, they were naked. Thick steel ropes, each nearly half an inch wide, stretched through the fuselage. The wind at nearly 300 miles per hour pulled at them violently. If no one held them steady, the aircraft would not respond to the pilot at all. Staff Sergeant George Simonelli moved up from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They saw the same thing. There was no argument. No orders were needed. They took positions near the bomb bay, where the main cable runs were visible. Someone had to become the flight controls. Up front, Swanson pressed his feet against the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The pedals were still bolted to the floor, but the cables they controlled were whipping in the wind far behind him. Without resistance, without tension, the controls were useless. He adjusted the throttles. Engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. That was all he had left. Power. But power alone could not control an aircraft like this. Without rudder and elevators, Mispa would eventually roll, stall, or spin. Any one of those outcomes would kill everyone aboard. In the bomb bay, the men wrapped their gloved hands around the steel cables. The metal was brutally cold. Even through thick gloves, it burned their skin. The cables vibrated constantly, trying to tear free. They pulled. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, the aircraft responded. The nose shifted left. When they pulled right, it shifted right. The elevators worked the same way. Pull back, the nose rose. Release, the nose dropped. It was working. But barely. Every movement had to be precise. Too much force and the bomber would overcorrect. Too little, and nothing would happen. There was no feedback. No instruments. No indicators. And communication was nearly impossible. The intercom system had been damaged in the blast. Voices were swallowed by the roar of the wind and engines. Swanson could not see the men pulling the cables. The crew could not see what Swanson was seeing. They had to guess. They learned by feel. Slowly, painfully, coordination began to form. Mispa continued falling behind the formation. The other B-17s were now several hundred yards ahead. Then half a mile. Then more. Dark shapes against the bright summer sky. Below them, Hungary stretched out in hostile territory. Flak still burst nearby, though less intense now that the formation had passed the main defensive zone. Even so, every second in the air was dangerous. Then another problem appeared. Mispa began to lose altitude. Not rapidly. Not dramatically. But steadily. They had been at 30,000 feet over the target. Now they were at 29,000. Then 28. Swanson had no altimeter. He judged by the feel of the aircraft, by the horizon, by experience. Every pilot knew how altitude felt, even without instruments. And this felt wrong. The men in the bomb bay felt it too. Gravity pressed slightly harder. The angle of the floor shifted just enough to notice. Their hands began to cramp. The steel cables cut into their gloves. Blood flow to their fingers slowed. Pain shot through wrists and forearms. But they kept pulling. There was no other choice. The formation ahead continued on its course, heading southwest toward the Adriatic Sea. Toward safety. Mispa could not keep up. By 9:46 a.m., the distance was undeniable. They were alone. The formation was now miles ahead, shrinking into the distance. A cluster of aircraft moving together, protected by numbers. Mispa was a single, crippled bomber. German fighter pilots hunted for aircraft like this. A lone B-17, damaged, falling behind, was an ideal target. Swanson scanned the sky as best he could. Without a nose, his field of view was wide but chaotic. Cold air blasted his face. Tears streamed from his eyes and froze on his cheeks. Beside him, co-pilot Paul Berndt watched the wings and engines closely. His own controls were gone, his instruments destroyed, but his eyes were still useful. So far, no fighters appeared. But the danger was growing by the second. Fuel was another unknown. The gauges were gone. The instrument panel had vanished with the nose. Swanson had no idea how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks. A fully fueled B-17 carried thousands of gallons. Under normal cruise conditions, four engines burned fuel steadily and predictably. This was not normal. 3 engines were running at high power, fighting drag from the missing nose, fighting the loss of altitude. Fuel consumption was almost certainly higher than usual. But how much higher? No one knew. Navigation was also gone. The navigator was dead. The charts were gone. The instruments that told them heading and position no longer existed. Swanson had only one instruction in his mind. Fly southwest. Get out of Hungary. Get over Yugoslavia. Reach the Adriatic. Reach Italy. He adjusted engine power carefully. Every change required compensation from the men pulling cables behind him. They were becoming a single system now. Pilot, engines, and human hands replacing machinery. Then the men in the bomb bay began waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft. Something was wrong. Swanson could not turn to look. The force of the wind through the open nose made movement dangerous. If he unbuckled, he risked being pulled forward and out of the aircraft. He stayed locked in place. The waving continued. The message was clear. The aircraft was failing in another way. In the tail section, Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, felt the change first. The tail of a B-17 was the most isolated position on the aircraft. A small metal compartment, far from the cockpit, far from the engines. Tucker felt the structure flex. Not vibration. Not turbulence. Flexing. The metal framework that supported the vertical and horizontal stabilizers was moving in ways it never should. The explosion at the nose had sent shock waves through the fuselage. Shrapnel may have weakened critical support beams. Now the damage was revealing itself. If the tail failed, the aircraft would be lost instantly. A bomber without a tail could not be saved. It would spin out of control and tear itself apart in seconds. The men in the bomb bay understood the signal. They could see the fuselage twisting slightly. They could feel it through their boots. MISPA was still flying. But it was coming apart. By 9:48 a.m., MISPA was no longer a bomber. It was a wounded machine held together by force of will. The aircraft continued descending. Slowly, but without mercy. 27,000 feet. Then 26. Inside the fuselage, every man could feel it. The tail section flexed again. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker gripped the sides of his tail gun position. The metal beneath his gloves shifted slightly, like a bridge under too much weight. It was subtle, but unmistakable. This was not turbulence. This was failure. Tucker knew aircraft. He knew when something was wrong. And this was very wrong. He crawled forward through the narrow passage toward the waist gun area, shouting warnings into the roaring wind. His voice was lost, but his urgency was not. He waved his arms, pointing back toward the tail. The men in the bomb bay understood immediately. If the tail came off, no one would survive. MISPA was now at 26,000 feet, still heading southwest, still barely under control. The men pulling the cables were exhausted. Their hands were numb. Blood seeped through torn gloves where steel had cut into skin. But they kept pulling. Swanson felt the strain through the aircraft. Every correction took longer now. Every movement felt delayed, heavy. The bomber was fighting gravity, drag, and structural damage all at once. The flak had stopped. That was the first good sign in minutes. The black bursts no longer filled the sky. No more explosions rocked the air around them. That meant they were likely out of the heaviest defensive zone. It meant they might have crossed into Yugoslavia. Swanson could not be sure. He had no map. No instruments. No navigator. But the silence of Flak meant hope. Small hope. Hope measured in minutes. Fuel remained a mystery. The engines sounded steady, but that meant nothing. Radial engines did not warn before quitting. They ran perfectly until the fuel was gone. Then they stopped. All at once. Swanson made a decision. The aircraft was dying. The tail was failing. Fuel was unknown. Control depended on men pulling cables by hand. Every minute they stayed airborne increased the chance of catastrophic breakup. If MISPA disintegrated at altitude, no one would live. But if the crew bailed out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of them would survive. They would be captured. But they would be alive. The problem was communication. The intercom was dead. The wind was too loud. There was no way to shout instructions from the cockpit to the bomb bay. And Swanson could not leave his seat. If he unbuckled, even for a moment, the aircraft would lose what little control it had. The men pulling cables would have no reference. The bomber would roll or dive. Everyone would die. The crew understood this without words. They felt the tail flexing again. They saw cracks spreading along seams in the fuselage skin. They knew staying aboard meant gambling with seconds. They decided on their own. They would bail out. One by one. At approximately 9:52 a.m., MISPA passed through 24,000 feet. The first man moved to the waist gun window. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell clipped his parachute harness, checked it once, then again. He positioned himself at the opening. Wind hammered his body, trying to pull him out early. He did not hesitate. He jumped. The slipstream took him instantly. 1 second he was there. The next, he was gone. The aircraft lurched. With one less man holding cables, control became rougher. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly went next. Then Staff Sergeant George Simonelli. Then Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie. Each jump made the bomber harder to fly. The nose pitched slightly upward. The wings dipped left, then right. Swanson adjusted engine power carefully, trying to compensate, but engines alone were not enough. He needed rudder. He needed elevators. He needed the men who were now leaving the aircraft. But they had no choice. In the tail, Charles Tucker crawled forward as fast as he could. He emerged into the waist gun area and saw empty positions where his crew mates had stood moments earlier. He saw the cables. Slack. No hands pulling them. He knew what that meant. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men were descending under parachutes over Yugoslavia. 5 men would survive. That left 5 still aboard. MISPA was now at 22,000 feet. The descent continued. The tail flexed violently again. The remaining crew moved quickly. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, a waist gunner, jumped next. Then Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, another waist gunner, followed seconds later. Each departure pushed the aircraft closer to the edge of control. The bomber wallowed. It no longer responded cleanly to throttle changes. Its inherent stability, designed by Boeing engineers for normal flight, was being pushed far beyond limits. At 9:56 a.m., the last crew member in the rear reached the exit and jumped. Now only 2 men remained aboard. Evald Swanson, the pilot. Paul Berndt, the co-pilot. 2 men in a bomber that should not have been flying. MISPA passed through 20,000 feet. 3 engines still ran. The bomber still moved forward. But it was no longer truly controllable. The cables hung loose. No one pulled them now. Swanson could only adjust power and hope physics remained on his side. He turned his head slightly and looked at Berndt. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Berndt had no controls. No function. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft broke apart or hit the ground. The choice was clear. Berndt unbuckled his harness. He stood carefully, bracing against the violent wind. He moved behind the cockpit through the narrow crawlway toward the waist gun area. Before leaving, he looked back at Swanson one final time. The pilot sat rigid in his seat, hands on the throttles, eyes forward, holding the bomber steady for as long as he could. Berndt nodded once. Then he disappeared toward the rear. Seconds later, he jumped. Evald Swanson was alone. 1 man. 1 damaged B-17. 19,000 feet above enemy territory. The bomber descended at roughly 200 feet per minute. Not a dive. Not yet. Just a steady, unstoppable fall. 3 engines continued roaring, burning fuel at an unknown rate. The missing nose created massive drag. The aircraft's shape was ruined. It flew like a brick with wings. Swanson estimated their position. They had been flying southwest for nearly 15 minutes. At reduced speed, that meant perhaps 40 miles covered. Enough to reach Yugoslavia. Maybe even beyond. But it was all guesswork. Now came the final question. How long should he stay? Every extra minute gave his crew more distance from the crash site. More distance meant better odds of survival. But staying too long meant dying with the aircraft. At 9:58 a.m., Swanson decided. 2 more minutes. Then he would go. At 10 a.m. exactly, Evald Swanson let go. He released the throttles. The moment his hands left them, the aircraft reacted. Without constant correction, Mispa began a gentle roll to the left. Nothing violent. Just enough to remind him that the bomber no longer wanted to stay in the air. Swanson unbuckled his harness. Instantly, the wind tried to pull him forward toward the massive opening where the nose of the aircraft used to be. He leaned back against the seat, braced himself, and stood up carefully. The bomber's nose dipped. The control cables hung loose now, whipping freely through the bomb bay. No one was holding them. No one was guiding the aircraft anymore. Mispa began to accelerate. Not straight down. Not yet. But into a steeper and steeper descent. Swanson moved fast. He turned toward the rear of the cockpit and squeezed into the narrow crawlway leading toward the bomb bay. The aircraft shuddered as speed increased. Wind howled through the fuselage, louder than anything he had heard before. Behind him, the B-17 was starting to fall. Swanson knew the math. Once the dive steepened, the G-forces would pin him in place. If that happened before he reached an exit, he would never get out. He had seconds. He emerged into the waist gun area. The aluminum floor vibrated under his boots. The walls hummed with strain. Somewhere behind him, the tail structure creaked and flexed. He grabbed his parachute pack from its rack. Clipped it on. Checked it once. No second chances. The bomber was now diving noticeably. Not vertical, but fast enough that Swanson had to brace himself to stay upright. Air screamed past the open waist gun window. He stepped toward it. 17,000 feet below, the Yugoslav countryside rushed closer. Forests, fields. Small villages. Somewhere down there were German troops. Somewhere down there were the men who had jumped minutes before him. Swanson did not hesitate. He jumped. The slipstream hit him like a solid wall. The force spun him sideways, tumbling him through empty air. The B-17 flashed past, engines still roaring, already hundreds of feet away and accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed violently. The sudden jerk ripped the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded across his shoulders and chest. Then everything went quiet. Not silence. But calm. Above him, the parachute canopy billowed open. Below him, the earth waited. Swanson looked down and watched Mispa fall. The bomber was still mostly intact, but it was bending now. The rear fuselage twisted unnaturally. The tail shook violently, like a branch about to snap. At around 15,000 feet, it happened. The tail section tore away. The B-17's remaining body pitched nose down almost vertically. It fell for a few more seconds, then disappeared into a line of trees miles away. A moment later, a column of black smoke rose. Fuel tanks ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. If Swanson had stayed aboard 30 seconds longer, he would have died with it. The parachute descent felt slow. Peaceful, almost unreal after the chaos of the last minutes. Swanson drifted with the wind, carried southwest over rolling countryside. His war was over. He was no longer a pilot. He was a man falling into enemy territory. The ground came up faster than expected. Swanson tried to steer toward an open field, pulling gently on the parachute lines. But the canopy was not designed for precision. Trees filled his vision. He hit the upper branches at about 15 miles per hour. Branches snapped. The parachute caught. His body slammed sideways into a thick limb. Pain exploded through his left leg. The bone broke cleanly. Swanson fell again, crashing through leaves and branches, then stopped suddenly, hanging in the harness about 15 feet above the ground. Blood ran down his leg. His flight suit was torn. Deep cuts covered his thigh where branches had ripped through fabric and skin. His left leg bent at an unnatural angle. He could not move. He could not climb. He hung there, suspended, trying not to pass out. Then he heard voices. German voices. Soldiers arrived within minutes. Wehrmacht infantry from a local occupation unit. They had seen the parachutes. They had heard the crash. They looked up at Swanson hanging in the tree. One of them shouted to him. Swanson did not respond. He could not. The soldiers talked among themselves, then left briefly. They returned with a ladder from a nearby farm. Two men climbed up carefully and cut the parachute lines. They lowered Swanson slowly to the ground. A German medic arrived. He examined the broken leg, the bleeding cuts, the shock. He worked quickly. A temporary splint made from wooden boards. Bandages wrapped tightly. Morphine injected. The pain dulled. Swanson felt the world soften around the edges. He was transported to a local command post, then to a German medical facility. A doctor confirmed the fracture and set the bone properly. Despite the morphine, the procedure was agony. Swanson passed out twice. When he woke, his leg was sealed in a heavy plaster cast from ankle to hip. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mispa's crew was captured. Every man who had jumped survived the landing. None escaped. The countryside was heavily patrolled. One by one, they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson saw them arrive. Paul Berndt. Frank Menzi. George Simonelli. Robert Bell. Charles Kelly. Charles Tucker. Paul Hish. All alive. All now prisoners of war. Evald Swanson's war did not end with the crash. It only changed form. From the hospital, he was transported by rail to a German prisoner processing center. His leg remained in a heavy cast. He could not walk without help. German guards moved him on a stretcher, then into crowded boxcars with other captured airmen. The journey took days. Little food. Almost no water. Cold nights. Uncertainty everywhere. Eventually, Swanson arrived at a Luftwaffe-run prisoner of war camp for Allied airmen. It was a place surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and searchlights. Wooden barracks stretched across frozen ground. Inside, bunks were stacked 3 levels high. This would be home. For now. The Germans followed the Geneva Convention. Prisoners were not beaten. They were fed enough to survive, not enough to feel strong. Medical care existed, but supplies were limited. Swanson's broken leg healed slowly. Weeks turned into months. He learned the routine quickly. Roll call. Thin soup. Bread rations. Long empty hours. Occasional Red Cross parcels that felt like treasure chests. Chocolate. Cigarettes. Soap. Men shared everything. Stories became currency. Each man carried memories from the sky. Flak bursts. Burning engines. Friends lost. Bombers that never came back. At night, they talked quietly in the dark. About home. About families. About the war ending. About survival. Swanson met airmen from across the Allied world. Americans. British. Canadians. Australians. Men who had flown dozens of missions. Men shot down on their first. Men who watched entire crews vanish in fireballs. Time moved strangely in captivity. Some days felt endless. Some months vanished. Outside the wire, the war turned. By late 1944, the sound of distant artillery sometimes rolled across the countryside. German guards grew thinner. Supplies worsened. Air raid sirens wailed more often, not for Allied bombers anymore, but for Allied fighters roaming freely over Germany. The balance had shifted. In early 1945, conditions deteriorated sharply. Food rations were cut. Guards looked tired, older, nervous. Rumors spread through the camp like wildfire. The Americans are close. The Russians are closer. Germany is collapsing. Then, one morning, the guards did not show up. The gates remained locked. The towers were empty. Prisoners waited. Hours passed. Finally, cautiously, a small group approached the main gate. Someone pushed. It opened. The camp was abandoned. Swanson watched from his bunk as men ran, laughed, cried. Some collapsed to their knees. Others simply stood, unable to move. Freedom felt unreal. Within days, Allied ground forces arrived. Medical teams. Trucks. Officers with clean uniforms and confident voices. Ewald Swanson was free. He was evacuated, treated, and eventually sent home. The war was over. But it never truly left him. Back in the United States, Swanson tried to return to normal life. He married. He worked. He lived quietly. Like many veterans, he spoke little about the war. But the memories remained. The sound of wind tearing through open metal. The moment he let go of the throttles. Watching his aircraft die below him. Years passed. Decades. Then, in the early 1980s, something unexpected happened. A team of aviation historians and veterans located the crash site of Mispa in what was then Yugoslavia. The wreckage had remained scattered in the forest for nearly 40 years. They contacted Swanson. Asked him if he wanted to see it. He said yes. In 1984, Ewald Swanson returned to the place where his B-17 had ended its flight. Pieces of aluminum still lay half buried in soil. Engine fragments rusted silently. Twisted metal told the story of violent impact. Swanson walked slowly among the remains. This was where it ended. And where he survived. Standing there, older now, he realized something clearly for the first time. The mission had failed. The aircraft was lost. But the crew lived. Every man aboard Mispa survived the shootdown. That was not luck. That was leadership. That was calm under fire. That was trust between men in impossible circumstances. Ewald Swanson died in 1996. He was 78 years old. He never wrote a memoir. He never sought fame. His story lived quietly in military records, in the memories of his crew, and in the silence of forests where aluminum still rests beneath leaves. But his story matters. Because World War II was not only won by famous generals or massive armies. It was won by ordinary men who faced moments where fear could have destroyed them. Men who made the right decision with seconds left. Men who let go. Men who jumped. Men who survived. And in doing so, carried the weight of war for the rest of their lives.